Hey everyone, thank you for being here and for being in my talk. I'm very honored that you chose to spend your time with me. So what I'm going to do is probably do about 20 minutes of talking and then 5 minutes of Q&A, and I'll be asking you questions during the talk. If you don't respond, I'll be very lonely, so please do feel free to be engaged. There's a lot of information that I wanted to share, and I've cut down a lot here, but there's still a lot of information. So feel free to contact me, and you get a copy of the slides, and you also get a copy of the deck itself. Now, to give some context, I was that kid in school who started selling sweets on the playground. Sweets turned into vending machines turned into e-commerce stores, e-commerce turned into SaaS. And over the past 10 years, I must have created about 100 companies, the vast majority of which completely burned and crashed. I lost time, I was frustrated, there was a lot of opportunities that I missed out on because I was at home being a nerd on my computer trying to create businesses. And very fortunately, I've had 2 exits, both, well, one to a PE firm and one to a competitor. And the thing that I wish I remembered was how to create a systematic approach, because every single one of those challenges, those problems that are stereotypical to an entrepreneur, I've done myself. I've made businesses for no one in particular. I've spoken to people who would say, yes, this is a fantastic idea, and then I'm like, great, get your card out, and they're like, maybe not. And what I'm doing here is I'm providing you sort of like a systematic, strategic approach that you can use to understand your company and then also run experiments to grow it. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover these 3 main areas here: understanding growth, so understanding who your customer is and how the product works. Then we're going to be looking at experimentation. So instead of just launching big things, how do we test different ideas out to validate or invalidate assumptions? And then finally, I've got some resources that you can use. Now, I love making friends, so you'll see a QR code at the bottom of every slide. If you scan that, you can book a meeting with me, and I'll also give you access to these slides and much, much more. So one of the biggest issues that people have is when you start a business, when you start an idea, you're very excited about it. You can imagine where you want it to go, right? You have a number in your head. Maybe you want 1 million, 10 million, 100 million pound revenue or something like that. You want to sell it to a competitor. But the challenge that people have isn't the goal. It's figuring out, what do I do in order to achieve that? That's the biggest issue, because there's lots of things you could do, but there's only one of you, or there's very limited time, there's limited resource. What do you start by doing? Now, what I'm going to do is sort of teach you a process that you can use to understand what specific activities you need to do. Raise your hand if you've heard of growth hacking. Growth hacking? Yeah, keep it up if you like the concept of growth hacking. Okay, I hate it. So I do what I call slow, boring growth, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's not really slow or boring. What it is very thoughtful, data-driven growth. And what I want to sort of go through is the difference between more conventional and this experimentation-based approach. What I used to do is I'd come up with an idea, I'd create a website for it, I'd think it's the best thing since sliced cheese. I would then create a massive campaign, I would launch my campaign, and I would get 0 results. And then I would say to myself, I've just spent so much time, so much effort on doing something that doesn't even work. And eventually I realized that I had to be a bit more agile and thoughtful in what I was doing. So the secret that I found is actually you need to answer 4 questions. Now, I think what a lot of people struggle with is they say to themselves, I need to create a marketing strategy. But there's 2 issues with that. One, if I create it, what happens if it's wrong? Because subconsciously, if this business is my baby, and I'm really scared about creating it because I don't really know, and I don't really want to make a mistake. So I'm very conscious of that. And the next is, they might create it, and very often what happens is people go into ChatGPT and say, hey, I'm creating a marketing strategy for this business. ChatGPT gives something, and then you ignore it for the rest of your life. And that's one of the biggest challenges. So instead of thinking about the whole marketing strategy, I'm going to teach you these 4 techniques. First is, why does your customer need this? How do they describe the problem? Where do they look for answers? And who has this problem, right? And it sounds really simple, and it is, thankfully, because there are people much cleverer than myself who've developed frameworks that you can use to answer each one of these questions. So the first one is the jobs to be done method. Who's heard of jobs to be done? Okay, cool. If you haven't, it's a great framework. Now, One of the big issues, and I think probably the biggest issue that most founders have, is they come up with an idea, they're really excited about it, but they don't truly understand the specific problem that their business is solving, right? So for example, I love this graphic here, because when someone buys a skateboard, do they very rarely buy it for the skateboard itself? You know, it's not the alloy components that people are excited about, it's going over a jump, right? And regardless of what your product is, the vast majority of the time, you're actually creating a product to solve an emotion. I used to work for a competitor to SAP. Who's heard of SAP? Oh man, I'm so sorry for all of you. It's the most driest, most boring piece of software in your life. And I apologize if there's someone who works at SAP here. And so I used to work for a competitor, and we would be pitching the users of SAP. And I would interview these people, and they were generally like young salespeople, just new with kids. And I would say to them, I'd talk to them about how they use it, the functionality, and all that. And they would say to me, gotta go, Daniel. I gotta go pick up my kids from school. And we launched a series of different campaigns based on this customer research. But the campaign that got the highest engagement wasn't talking about how efficient it was. It was talking about get home to your kids sooner with IBM Watson, which was the company that I was contracting for. So we didn't talk about the functionality. We didn't say it's 0.5% faster, which is one of the campaigns that was already running. Who cares about 0.5%? But it was get home to your kids sooner. Because at the end of the day, what they wanted to do is they wanted to be able to use the software and then actually make their boss happy, make lots of money, buy their next watch, get their second mortgage, and actually be able to spend time with their families. And regardless of what your product is, very often you are solving an emotional problem. And the more effectively you can understand the problem that you're solving, the more effectively you'll be able to understand your customers. Everyone with me so far? There is a test at the end. Okay, so this is probably the hardest aspect for being a founder. The problem that they have is when you come up with an idea, you spend your life thinking about it. Your business is your baby. And what happens is you develop a set of language that you use to describe your product. But the challenge you have is actually the way that you describe it and the way that your customers describe it are often very different. What I mean by that is I used to work for an e-commerce platform, one that you may have heard of. And everyone in the company was a developer, apart from me. And of course, the marketing guy is not a developer. And I would take my customers out for pints, company-sponsored alcohol. It was great. And I would have a conversation with them about how do they use our product, where do they use it, these kind of things. And after I went to this pub in London, and after a couple of pints, I said to this guy, how would you describe our platform to your friend who was also a customer? And he said, it's a shop in one line of code. And I thought that was really interesting because previously, as the only non-developer on the team, and all the developers were telling me, Daniel, this is the fastest thing, you know, super fast JavaScript, blah, 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 blah. I didn't understand any of it. I was just like, cool, you pay my salary, fantastic. And what I realized is that the client didn't actually care about the speed of the platform. They cared about the convenience of the platform. And that's really difficult because if everyone around you is telling you one thing, what you have to realize is that actually your product might be described by your customers in a different way. So the framework for this one is called a strategic messaging map. If you literally Google it, you'll be able to find it. And what I love about it is that it provides a really organic way of describing your product. So you start at the top with things like slogan, and then you work your way down based on the customer persona, and you have very specific ways that you can describe your product. And I find this a really, really useful tool that you can follow. One of the big issues that people have is they don't want to create these frameworks, they don't want to do messaging maps because first of all, things change, and second of all, they're kind of scared because they don't really know. And actually, not knowing is kind of scary because your ego is attached to the success or failure of your business. If you know something, then what happens if you get it wrong, right? So what I recommend is that you do these frameworks, and the first iteration is completely okay to be wrong, because that's not the goal. The goal is to get your first version done, and every time you have a conversation with a customer, you update it to make it more accurate. So the next is a user journey map. And what I mean by this is, unfortunately, no one wakes up and they say, they wake up and from a dream they say, fantastic, I want to sign up to this software. What they do is they wake up and they're frustrated about something, because vast majority of actions come from some sort of frustration or fear or stress. And then they say, how do I solve this problem? Well, maybe they go to WhatsApp and they speak to their friends. Maybe they watch a webinar. Maybe they read a blog article. It doesn't matter. But they go through a series of different stages. And one of the issues that a lot of people have is they go to these people who they think are their customer, and they say, hey, sign up to my product. But the problem is that these people are just still trying to figure out what is the actual problem that I'm stressing out about? What is the problem that I'm struggling with? And what you really want to do is you want to develop a relationship with your customer. And what I mean by a relationship is kind of in the same way that if I went out and I said to someone, hey, you seem cool, let's get married, they're going to say, go away, I don't know who you are. But theoretically, I could go up to someone and I could say, you seem really cool, let's go for a coffee. And over a series of different events, hopefully, I can then pop the question. And it's kind of the same with your customers. If you try and sell them too early, then what's going to happen is they're going to say, I don't know what your product does. I don't understand the value of what you provide. And that's why it's important to understand what are the different steps that you can take. So with this framework, and there's lots of different frameworks, my favorite is called Pirate R. And awareness, consideration, purchase, and retention advocacy. Awareness is when people discover that they have a problem. Consideration is when they're actually looking at what's available. Purchase is when they actually take that moment to give you money in exchange for the value of your product. Retention is when they stay with you for a period of time. And advocacy is when they love your product so much that they then say, I want to go speak to other people. And thankfully, there's a bunch of frameworks that you can use to understand what are those different steps. And this is one of those areas where I really recommend that you develop a user journey map and then you update it based on conversations. Because what you'll find is that most people find your product in the same way. And if you can understand where those people are, you can understand where you need to market towards them and also how you need to communicate with them. Because based on the emotion at different stages depends on what you say and how you say it. And here's some channels that you can use as inspo for the experimentation process that's coming up next. So at this point, you know what to say, where to say it, who to say it to, and why they're actually engaging with your product. And each one of those frameworks, they kind of layer on top of each other and act in a way that works together. So just before I go on to the next stage, I want to talk a little bit about this user journey map. So what's really important is being able to measure each different stage of where your customer is. So thinking about all the way from them being aware of the problem that they have, all the way to the point where they're like, yeah, I want to tell my friends about it because I think this is so cool. So before I get on to experimentation, I want to talk about the three main issues of why I failed. The first was scaling before validating. And what I mean by that is I thought I had the best idea in the world. I thought I was Steve Jobs. I didn't need to speak to my customers because I knew better. I knew what people wanted before they even knew it. Turns out I don't. I'm not that clever. And what I had to do is actually figure out what do I believe to be true and what do I know to be true. And then actually testing out those different assumptions because I've realized I am wrong like literally always about everything. And that's why it's important to break it down and figure out which bits am I not sure about and which bits am I sure. I'm also ADHD. I want to do everything and I want it yesterday. I'm currently running like 4 businesses, which is a terrible idea. So I probably don't practice what I preach. But focusing enables you to be a lot more successful. And that's something that I'm still struggling on. And next is success criteria. So when you're performing these experiments, it's really important that you understand what it is that is. How do you know when you've won? How do you know if something works out? Because sometimes you launch something, you get some engagement, and you're like, cool, I think this works. And it's not bad enough that you immediately stop it, and it's not good enough that you're like, yes, I absolutely need to scale this. So, experimentation. Now, this very intimidating looking spreadsheet is a growth map. You can scan the QR code, and you can get a copy of it as well. So our end goal is to create this spreadsheet, right? And what I'm going to do is go through the different stages of the spreadsheet. Okay, hope you scanned it. If you didn't, too late. So in order to complete that spreadsheet, we've got 8 different steps: capture, hypothesize, prioritize, design, run, analyze, document, and scale. I told you there's a lot of information. So the first idea is to come up with ideas. Generally, you have the right ideas that are going to result in your business to grow. The issue that most people have is actually doing something that's strategic and systematic. And so the first thing that I do when I'm working with teams is I come up with a brainstorm. I come up with a bunch of ideas. And I work with those teams, and very often what I say to them is, I come up with some really stupid ideas so that the team doesn't feel uncomfortable with sharing ideas that might not be great. So I say, let's hire a blimp and let's stick that over the city. And then every time everyone's like, oh, my idea is not as stupid as Daniel's, so I'm going to share it with them. And ideas come from everyone in the company. So come up with ideas and don't focus on quality at this stage, just focus on what seems like a cool idea. Okay, so the next is to write a hypothesis. So this is, what do you believe is going to happen when you come up with this idea? And I think it's really important to come up with a very systematic, very quantifiable approach so that there's a binary answer of did this success or fail? And I just realized I misspelled hypothesis. So this is one of my favorite bits, how to measure and prioritize. So this is a very crude measurement that you can use. Who's seen the ICE prioritization in the past? Okay, we've got a few product managers here. So the way that you can do this is by adding a number up to 5 for each one of these areas. Impact, confidence, and ease. Impact, how successful, if this succeeds, how much impact will this have on the total goals of my idea? Confidence, how likely do I believe this to be true? And ease, how much time and effort is this going to take in order for me to create it? And then you total the number. And then the great way is it provides a really quick, easy method for you to prioritize which ideas you want to do first and what you want to do later. Next is, now that you've got the hypothesis and you understand the priorities, is to actually create the test itself. So specifically, what are you testing? Is it top of funnel marketing? Is it a product test? Things like that. Having clear understanding of budget and duration, I think, is really important. This can be very difficult at the beginning because people are like, I don't know how long to test it for. But you'll only be able to understand that once you gather a bit more data. And then figuring out, what do you win? Okay, so once you've been able to do that, the next stage is to actually execute your experiment and to run it and to gather that data. Then you have to take time to analyze your experiment. One of the biggest issues that people have is they're so excited about their idea. They've got so many different things that they want to do, but if something doesn't work, they then just jump onto the next thing. And that's kind of one of the big issues, because what often happens is you end up repeating the same mistakes again and again and again, because you don't take a moment to step back and say, what worked? Why did this work? And even if it didn't work, that helps you understand which of your assumptions that you thought were true are incorrect. So maybe it's the messaging. Maybe this doesn't work with that specific audience. Maybe it's the channel doesn't actually resonate with the audience, or the messaging doesn't work on that channel. Figuring out what that is unique to you and your company, and I think it's really important to take that moment and to figure that out. The next is to document. Now, what I do is I create a Wikipedia in Notion. And every time we perform an experiment, I add learnings to that Wikipedia. And it's accessed by everyone in the company. And what that enables you to do is actually to, every time you lose money, you can actually be able to have some sort of learnings from that so that you're not making the same mistakes again and again. And then finally, you can figure out, did this succeed? Do I want to continue scaling it? If so, fantastic. And if not, what do I want to do differently in the future? So a quick example that you can use here is, and this is based on a project that I did for Monday, instead of having focusing on the actual feature set, think about what is the emotion that we're trying to solve and who we're trying to solve it for. And what I always recommend is speak to your customers, because using the words of your customers or the words that you think are your customers is so much easier than you trying to brainstorm these things yourself. I always thought I was going to be a great copywriter and be able to come up with these things. Turns out I can't. What my customers are saying is always better than anything I can come up with. And you can literally just copy and paste kind of their conversations, and it really, really works. So some things to think about. First is growth marketing is a process, not a tactic. It's kind of why I don't like growth hacking, because very often it's people who do one thing that achieves a specific virality, but it's not continuous, it's not predictable, it's not repeatable, and it's not scalable. Next is speak to your customers. Unless you're very, very confident through different conversations, it's really important to have to continually speak to your customers as much as possible, because even the assumptions that you previously had might be different from what they are now. Use numbers, not emotions, and I mean that in terms of figuring out if something succeeds or not. Obviously, your product solves an emotion, and understanding what that emotion is, it's really important. And also, everything is a process, so you want to be doing these things continuously over time. So something that you can do if you've got a business already running is you can actually speak to your customers and say, why did you buy from us? People love talking. People love talking about themselves. So if you can give them an opportunity to do that, very often they will. And here's a framework that you can do later. So just as a quick reminder, the first is, what is the problem you're solving, the jobs to be done? How do your customers describe it? What are the steps they take from waking up in the morning to becoming an active and loyal customer? And then who's the person that specifically experiences this? Once you've been able to do that, you can then develop an experimentation process using the spreadsheet attached. Hi, I'm Daniel. Some cool claims to fame. I've worked over the past 5 years. We've generated over 100 million in revenue for different clients. One of my favorite statistics is that by total unique impressions, more people that use the internet than don't have seen my work. So it's likely you've seen something that I've produced. It might have been the most boring advertising, I don't know, but you've probably seen it. And I'm very fortunate to do talks at a bunch of different places. I also love talking about food, so feel free to talk to me about that after. If you want help, I do fractional CMO stuff, growth sprints, advisory, but I also just love talking about startups, so feel free to have a chat with me, and more than happy to point you in the right direction, talk to you about this process, or share some resources that I have. Cool. Thank you very much. I said there was going to be a test at the end. Does anyone have any questions?
In what sense do you think that AI will change this whole process? And I don't mean practically, but more the way people search for products is going to change. In the past, you had to hit the emotion. You had to hit what people do. Now, you have to hit what the AI is going to think you want.
Yeah. So it's interesting because this entire process, I'm also AI-ifying right now, where you can insert all your business details, and it does all of the experimentation, the customer research, it creates the frameworks, and it continually updates based on customer feedback. So that's on a very practical perspective, and that is coming. The other bit is, the better you understand your customers, the more effectively you can understand what they're thinking before they even use these LLMs. And I think increasingly so, understanding the basics is so fundamental. It's really boring, so a lot of people don't do it. But actually, I think in an increasingly competitive space where it's easier to develop products and there is more competition, the more effectively you can understand your customer by following these frameworks, the more effectively you can sell to them. Yeah, good question.
After making the analysis, how do you move forward with this? Now you have all the data, all the information, all these things. Now you need to tell somebody because you want to go the next step, which is creating ads or posting, marketing or whatever. Maybe you have a person who does this. So how does your advising the next person what to do process work?
That's a good question. So I think if you're going to be outsourcing your marketing to other people, having this information really helps them understand who they need to speak to. And also, I always recommend that the founders do the basics, some of the initial experiments themselves. So I think founders should get stuck in marketing because I think one of the big issues is the gap between founders and understanding how marketing works. I think it's really difficult when you're creating a product because to you, it seems like a great idea. but actually you have to figure out how to align it with the customers. So starting off by running ads yourself, by doing whatever the experiment that you want to focus on, is an important activity to try at the beginning.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the questions.
chat.
If you have more questions, grab him in the coffee break. Here's your applause.
Thank you.